My name is Phillip Hockley and I'll be giving this lecture today, the title of which is A New View of God and its effect on well-being. And during this talk I'll be sharing with you a personal account of what a new view of God did in my life and the effect that it had on my well-being. But I'll then go on to introduce some accounts and stories of what happened when other people had such a view, and this was one of the most incredible things that I can't wait to share with you. But first of all, let's begin at the beginning. It was just over 20 years ago when I came in contact with Christian Science, and it was at a lecture just like this. However, at the time, I was registered as permanently physically handicapped. Now, this is the document that was issued by the British authorities to say that the person standing in front of you is permanently physically handicapped with no hope of a cure. And the handicaps that I was facing at that time may be different to other people's experience of handicaps, so I'll just share with you what my particular challenges were. First of all, I'd had an episode of arthritis as a young boy. This left me with one leg shorter than the other. This in turn caused a scoliosis or curvature of the spine, and that meant that my neck was off balance, and in later life, my neck started slipping and dislocating, locking really painfully, sometimes for weeks at a time. So at the time of the lecture, I was actually wearing a neck brace. Now, these were significant challenges, but they were not the worst challenge that I was facing, because by far the most serious challenge in the doctor's view was my weight loss issues. You see, I'd had unresolved stomach conditions which left me allergic to all kinds of normal food ingredients. This meant that I couldn't digest or absorb my meals, and this had gone on for over 7 years. In fact, at the time of the lecture, I was grossly underweight. My usual body weight before these challenges was about 185 pounds. At the time of that lecture, I was 105 pounds. So this really was the most serious thing that the doctors felt had to be addressed. They basically said that if I didn't find a way to absorb food, I could easily pass away that year. So when the doctors gave up on me, I didn't really take that lying down. In fact, I thought I would go out and find a cure in what's called the alternative therapies. So I went out and I sought every known alternative therapy from A to Z, from acupuncture all the way through to zone therapy and everything in between. Still, I didn't find a cure. Then, in my sheer desperation, I even reached out to some local Christian churches and asked if they would pray for me. Now, I say sheer desperation on purpose, because up until that point in my life, I had a very strong aversion to Christians after something that happened to me as a child. I'd had a very rough experience at the hands of some people that called themselves Christians. So to me, if somebody said they were a Christian, my natural reaction would be to just back off. Now I'm facing what looks like an early grave. I thought I'd give them a go. They all prayed for me in their different ways. Still, nothing helped. So now it looks like the only option left open to me is an early grave. A very dear friend of mine mentioned that she'd heard about a mindfulness technique that was designed to help people to prepare to die at peace. And so I investigated this mindfulness, and what it did basically was it taught me how to be aware of all of the pain and the sensations in the body, but to remain mentally undisturbed. And therefore I was feeling a greater sense of mental peace, even though my body was still breaking itself down. So this was quite helpful. So this was the condition that I was in on the night that I came to that lecture just over 20 years ago. I came to the venue with short, painful, shuffling footsteps. I was bowed over and breathless. I came to the front of the venue and I sat down, and I was just using that mindfulness technique to try and not react to all the pain and the inflammation caused by that short walk to this venue. And while I was sitting there, I didn't realize until people started clapping that the lecturer had walked out on stage. But within moments of her opening her mouth, my heart sank, because she said that that night's events were going to be based on God's great love for all mankind as found in the Bible. And I thought to myself, oh my goodness, they're Christians. Now I really wished I hadn't made the painful effort to get to the venue. Then the lecturer started reading from the Bible, and things did not get any better, I can tell you. She read from the first book of the Bible, Genesis, and this is what she read. God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Oh, really, I was thinking. So this lady wants me to accept now that God sees all of this. He's made me in God's image and likeness, and yet I'm full of all of this disease and discomfort and disability. Now I was just starting to think that my earlier opinion of Christians as being completely out of touch with reality was probably quite accurate. So now I've got no interest in anything else that was going to happen that night. I was actually just thinking about how long it would take for all the swelling to go down before I could leave the venue in disgust. But while I was sitting there, I heard some more ideas which again grabbed my attention, but again, not in a good way. And these ideas came from this book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, written by an American lady, Mary Baker Eddy. Now, if you've never heard of this book before, it doesn't matter, because on the night of that lecture, I had never heard of the book either. However, the ideas contained within it, alongside the Bible, they had a life-changing effect on me. And if you'll just bear with me, I'll share some of those ideas that I found so controversial when I first heard them. And this is one of them. God is at once the center and circumference of being. God is at once the center and circumference of being, I thought to myself. Now remember, I'd been passing my awareness through the body for a long period leading up to this event, and to me my center, as I understood it, was right here, and my circumference was just around the edges of my body. Now I knew it was full of disease and disability. The doctors agreed that it was full of disease and disability. This lady wants me to accept that God is the center and circumference of being. Now I flew into a mental rage. My human thinking was full of ill will and judgment about the whole event, when something else started to grab my attention. But this time it was in a really good way. And this is how it unfolded. I'm sitting there really angered at what I was hearing, and I couldn't accept any of it. My human thinking was full of judgment and ill will, when something started to open up in my thinking to a larger sense of consciousness than I had ever experienced before in my life. If you think of it just like this for a moment, the room that I'm in, it's got 4 walls and a roof. So this is a confined space, yes, defined by its boundaries. Imagine if you were to take the roof off on a clear blue sunny day and you looked up at the space above you. So the difference between that amount of space above compared to the confined space within this room, the difference would be remarkable, wouldn't it? This is some way of describing how I felt that night. It felt like my human thinking was in this enclosed, agitated state, but something started to open up above to a larger sense of consciousness that I noticed was incredibly peaceful, but I also noticed an increasing sense of feeling loved. Now, the love that I was feeling, it wasn't like any other love I'd ever experienced before. The love that had been freely exchanged with me by family and friends and girlfriends. It wasn't that kind of love. This love felt like it was pressing in on every square inch of my body. In fact, it reminded me of an experience I'd had quite a few years earlier when I'd learned to scuba dive. Because I noticed the deeper I went down into the water, the more you could feel the water pressure on every square inch of your body. Now, sitting in this lecture venue, it felt like that sense of love that I was feeling, it felt like it was pressing in on every square inch of me. And I was so amazed by this until I remembered, oh, Don't forget to pass your awareness through the body and remain undisturbed. So that's what I did. I went back to that mindfulness and I started to pass my awareness through the body, and to my amazement, I noticed the next remarkable thing. All of the pain, all of the inflammation and stiffness that I'd brought with me to the lecture, it was softening and loosening, and it all eventually just evaporated right before my very eyes. Quite literally the way that an ice cube would respond if you took it from the freezer compartment and placed it on a warm sunny windowsill. It literally went from sharp angled edges, then it would soften and become a puddle, and eventually the whole thing would just evaporate. Yes, that's the nature of an ice cube on a warm sunny windowsill. This is how all of the stiffness and the pain in the body, it felt like it was softening, loosening, until it eventually all just evaporated. Until I found myself sitting there in a completely sensationless body for the first time in my life. And I was so absorbed by this new experience, I didn't realize until everybody started clapping that the whole hour had finished. And I hadn't heard a blessed word she'd said. I was so absorbed with what was going on in the body. In fact, I tried to make a beeline for the exit without making eye contact with anybody, because I didn't want to strike up a conversation. And as I was leaving the building that night, they happened to have copies of Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures to give away. Now, some of you have come to the venue for this lecture. You'll be able to pick up a copy today. If you're not attending the venue and you get to see this as a recorded version online, there'll be contact details posted at the end of the lecture. You can reach out to those details and we'll get a copy to you. At that time, I was able to pick up a copy of the book. I took it and left the venue, not knowing why I took it. However, in the days and weeks after that lecture, that little book, Science and Health, alongside the Bible, became an absolute rock, explaining to me in bite-sized chunks exactly what had gone on that night. But at the time, I just needed to get home. So as I'm leaving the building, I noticed I'm taking long, effortless, pain-free strides. I'm standing tall. I'm breathing deeply. And I was so amazed by this, I literally mumbled under my breath something like, "What on earth just happened back there?" And to my amazement, I heard these words in my own thinking, as clear as a bell, say, "Philip, it's just like when you stopped believing in monsters under the bed." Now, I'll admit I found that really confusing, because at the time of the lecture I was in my mid-30s. I hadn't believed in monsters under the bed since I was about 5 years of age. But then I started to remember that painful couple of months as I continued walking home. It just occurred that I was starting this illogical belief that there was a monster living under my bed, and it just got worse and worse. I would wake up at night needing to go to the bathroom. I would be too afraid to put my feet on the floor in case the monster grabbed my legs. I'd end up sitting on the bed and just wetting myself. Now, this went on night after night, week after week, until I developed a pretty bad case of diaper rash. It was actually showing below my school shorts. The boys in school who noticed this, they started picking on me and bullying me for being a big baby. My school teachers were not very happy because I was tired and listless in class. So the daytimes were not pleasant. The night times, oh my goodness, they were terrifying. Every time I woke up in that darkened room, I felt this crushing grip of fear about that monster under the bed. Until one eventful night, I remember it clearly. I woke up desperately needing to go to the bathroom. Too afraid to place my feet on the floor in case that monster grabbed me. I'm just about to accept, oh, here we go again, when I heard these words clearly in my own thinking say, "Philip, why don't you just look under the bed?" I didn't hesitate. I looked under the bed, and what do you think I saw? No monster. That crushing grip of fear that had had me for those couple of months, it felt like it was released in that instant. You know the way that a dish sponge would work? If you squeeze a dish sponge, it's all distorted and out of shape. But if you release the grip, the dish sponge just pops back into its natural shape, doesn't it? Yes? It felt like I'd gone from this crushing fear to this fear being released, I felt like I just popped back into shape. I popped back into being the happy little chappy I'd been up until this episode. I stepped down off the bed, I toddled off to the bathroom, and I slept soundly from that night to this. But now, fast forward 30 years, I'm now leaving my first ever contact with Christian Science at a lecture just like this. I entered the building full of disabilities. I leave the building an hour later and I'm completely free from these disabilities, and I'm so confused I mumble under my breath, what on earth just happened back there? The answer that I got was, it's just like when you stopped believing in monsters under the bed. It seemed so puzzling to me at the start, but as I continued to walk home that night after the lecture, the similarities started to dawn on me. Just like that little boy who had that crushing fear of those monsters under the bed that were not real, this grown man had these crushing burdens told to him that, first of all, he's permanently physically handicapped, and then later they were starting to tell me that if I didn't find a way to absorb food, I was going to die of malnourishment. These had become crushing burdens on this otherwise happy and healthy young sportsman, until the night of that lecture something happened which released that crushing grip, and I felt like I just popped back into shape. Because quite literally, the very next morning, not only were my legs the same length, my spine was straight, and my neck was free from that day to this, but I started eating and absorbing normal food ingredients without any allergic reaction. In fact, within 4 weeks of that lecture, I regained those lost 80 pounds. No special diets and no special exercises. I literally just popped back into the shape that I'd been in before. Now, you can imagine then that as a lifelong atheist, I had a lot of questions for that little church that sponsored that lecture all those years ago. So I made my way over to what's called the Christian Science Reading Room. Christian Science churches and societies all over the world, they try to maintain what's called a Christian Science Reading Room, which is basically a public access library where you can come, you can study the scriptures, you can study the teachings of Christian Science, you can borrow or purchase the materials. If you don't have access to a Christian Science Reading Room anywhere near you, again, the contact details at the end of this lecture, we'll give you a directory of local churches or local Christian Science societies that'll be able to offer you those services. I was able to go to the reading room in my local town at that time. I made my way over there, and the first thing I said was, I want to find out more about that lady that was mentioned in the title of last night's lecture, Mary Baker Eddy. So they gave me some biographies to choose from. I chose one at random. I started to read about the lady, and I started to notice a couple of kind of themes appearing in her life story. It started out that she was born in the early 1800s in the New England area of America into a deeply religious family, and that she had a love of the Bible which stayed with her throughout her entire life. I also noticed that early years of her life, they were blighted by many periods of ill health. So she was quite a poorly, sickly child. Then she became a young adult. She experienced the joy of marriage, and just as her husband and her are expecting the appearance of their first child, her husband tragically died, leaving her a widow before the child arrived. As I'm reading this life story, I started to feel this strange sense of compassion for somebody that I've never met, because some of the challenges I was reading about, they reminded me of challenges my own grandmother had faced. And when it came to the point in Mrs. Eddy's story where she became widowed, it reminded me of the challenge my own mother had faced. So I'm now feeling this kind of open heart, kind of compassion for this person that I'm reading about, when the next chapter in her life story takes a terrible turn for the worse. She slipped and fell on an icy pavement in the winter of 1866, so badly injuring herself that everybody in attendance, including a local naturopathic doctor, they were convinced that she would not recover from these injuries. And while she was in this desperately low condition, Mrs. Eddy asks for a copy of her beloved Bible. She says that she opened the Bible at random and she started reading the pages of a healing account in the book of Matthew that she'd read many times in her earlier Bible studies. It was the healing of a man who was born with disabilities, came in contact with Christ Jesus and was healed at the first meeting. So Mrs. Eddy said she loved the story, but she'd read it many times. But this situation that she was in at this moment in her life, she was probably yearning more than ever to feel some crumbs of comfort from her love of the Bible and her love of the healing ministry of Christ Jesus. She said she started to notice that there was a presence of love in that room. Mrs. Eddy was alone in the room, so she started to wonder if it was maybe love as described in the Bible. God is described as love in the book of John. She said she became so conscious of this love that she suddenly rose up well. She dressed herself. She went into the next room and declared to everybody that she was well, but that she also now knew how to make other people well. She then spent the next 3 years of her life deeply searching the scriptures to see if there were any rules or laws to back up this remarkable experience that she'd had. At the end of those 3 years of deeply searching the scriptures, she came up with the first edition of this book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. She calls it a key to the scriptures on purpose. This is a very important point because Mrs. Eddy wasn't making any of this stuff up. She found that everything had its source first in the Bible. Then she wrote about it. And some of the Bible sources that were so inspiring to her at the time were like this. In Hebrews it says, "This is the covenant that I will make with them after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their hearts, and in their minds will I write them." Then, in her own words, Mrs. Eddy says in part, "I learned these truths in divine science, that all real being is in God, the divine mind, and that life, truth, and love are all powerful and ever present, that the opposite of truth, called error, sin, sickness, disease, death, is the false testimony of false material sense." Now, these material senses that Mrs. Eddy is referring to as false, they're the same 5 material senses I'm using so readily today, like hearing, sight, smell, taste, the regular material senses. So she's calling them false material sense, but then she introduces a concept called spiritual sense. And this is what she has to say about it. Spiritual sense is a conscious, constant capacity to understand God. Spiritual sense is a conscious, constant capacity to understand God. Now, when I first heard that language, it was in what's called the weekly Christian Science Bible lesson. Now, for me, these were genius ideas because they basically give you a couple of bite-sized chunks from the Bible describing the nature and qualities of God, and then a couple of little explanations, those key to the scriptures, to explain how to live those rules and laws of God practically in your daily life. So I was learning as a newcomer, remember, never studied the Bible before, a little bit about God and the nature of God first, and then a little bit about how to apply that practically in my daily life. And I was loving it. But when I heard that language, that spiritual sense is a conscious, constant, it reminded me of how my physics teacher had introduced the concept of radio waves to us. Basically, they said that all the time that they've been talking in that classroom, and I'll do the same today, all the time I've been talking, radio waves have been passing freely through every brick and beam of this building, but we are not conscious of them with our 5 material senses. Then the physics teacher did this. They picked up the radio.
Well, you'll need to pack a bag as we've plenty of travel coming.
And they did this.
Classic FM. The music is going to
So this is now proving that although my 5 material senses are not conscious of this broadcast, it doesn't mean that the broadcast is absent, does it? It just means my 5 material senses are not conscious of it. The physics teacher then went and did something even more important for me. They buried the antenna completely in their fist and turned the radio back on. This now is proving to me that those radio waves are even passing through every fibre of my body, completely undetected by my 5 material senses. And what I deduced from this is, just because my 5 material senses are not conscious of something, it doesn't mean that that thing is absent, does it? It just means my 5 material senses were not conscious of it. So it started to dawn on me that this spiritual sense that Mrs. Eddy was introducing to us was like something that could tune in, if you like, or receive something that the 5 material senses couldn't perceive. And this became the basis of what Mrs. Eddy taught as prayer in Christian Science. In fact, the first chapter of Science and Health is dedicated to prayer. And prayer basically for me, as I was learning it, was to quieten the 5 material senses, but to tune in, if you like, with my spiritual sense. And what is the spiritual sense tuning into? It's not just a radio broadcast, is it? The spiritual sense that Mrs. Eddy felt that she was starting to understand better as a result of that healing in 1866, she was starting to understand the nature of how the Christ appears in our daily lives. A concept of the Christ that she hadn't fully understood until that time. And again, she found her explanations of the Christ first in the Bible, then she goes on to comment about them. So let me share with you some of the passages in the Bible that supported Mrs. Eddy's case. From Colossians it says this: God would make known what is the riches of the glory of this mystery among the Gentiles, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. And then in Philippians it goes on to say, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. Mrs. Eddy, in her own words, she comments on the Christ many times in her writings, but in broad terms you could say she talks about the time of the Christ appearing at the time of a physical healing, but she also talks about how the Christ appears in our daily thinking. So an example of how the Christ appears at the time of a physical healing, she says, Christ, the divine manifestation of God, which comes to the flesh to destroy incarnate error. So that's the time of a physical healing. In our thinking during the day, Mrs. Eddy describes the Christ like this: Christ is the true idea, voice in good, the divine message from God to men speaking to the human consciousness. The divine message from God to men speaking to the human consciousness. How does it speak to our human consciousness, I thought? Is it through our spiritual sense? That spiritual sense which is a conscious, constant capacity to understand God. The God who made us, every man, woman and child in creation, in God's image and likeness. The God that says that those laws of God would be placed in our hearts and our minds. That's each and every one of us. And that the Bible promises us that we can let that mind be in us, which was also in Christ Jesus. This became a fascinating introduction for me to the practical relevance of the Bible in what we would call the modern age, because I thought the Bible was just an archaic book of old myths and blind belief and mumbo-jumbo. Now I was starting to realize that the Bible was full of spiritual promises and spiritual descriptions of laws that were promised and prophesied and then produced in the life and times of great spiritual luminaries. This became a really fascinating way for me to start learning more about the nature of God from the Bible and then how to apply it practically in my daily life from Science and Health. This was fascinating for me, although I was still a little bit confused on a couple of issues. One of the things I found rather confusing was this. We're regularly told in the Bible studies that God made man, every man, woman and child, in God's image and likeness. Now, I found this confusing for this reason. My only understanding of how an image and likeness worked at that time is the simple way that a reflection works when you look at a mirror. For instance, if I turned and faced a mirror here today, if there was a mirror across the room, it would be reflecting back the same long sleeve check shirt that I'm wearing. Yes? So I would turn and face the mirror. The image and likeness would have to reflect back the same long sleeve check shirt. Also, if I turn and face the mirror, because I'm not wearing a hat, the image and likeness can't reflect back all of this with a hat added to it. It couldn't do that, could it? This is an unbroken law of reflection, isn't it? As the original, so the image and likeness. So what I found really confusing is this. I've got 3 brothers who are all different shapes and sizes to me. If God made all of us in God's image and likeness, which one does God look like, I thought? Is it the tall guy or is it the small guy? It just didn't make any sense. And while I was struggling with this one morning in my Bible studies, I just thought I'd never get to the bottom of it. I heard these words really grab my attention. They said, Philip, you're standing in the wrong place. You need to back up onto the mirror. You're my image and likeness. Now this got me to thinking, and I pictured myself now as if I've backed up onto a mirror. So now I'm here as the image and likeness of what? What's the original, if you like, in front of the mirror, creating this image and likeness? Well, in the first few weeks of Bible studies, I'd learned that God is the spirit of life and truth and love. And as I was thinking about what God is, it dawned on me that as God's image and likeness, I must be able to reflect back those qualities. And the first thing I realized was this. If I couldn't accept God as the original, having arthritis many years earlier, how could the arthritis appear on God's reflection? If God didn't have one leg shorter than the other, which I couldn't accept, how could that one leg shorter than the other appear on the reflection? It can't. So this started to open up an incredible avenue of thought for me, not just explaining to me in simple ways how my healing had occurred, but it helped me to understand how all healings can happen in Christian Science prayer. Because people are starting to exchange the material view and all of the material evidence about what's going on in their lives regarding health and well-being. They're exchanging them for this more spiritual sense of what's going on in their life as made in God's image and likeness, first Genesis. And as I was thinking about this, and this was making a great impact on me, it started to dawn on me that if I'm made in God's image and likeness, so are all the people that I've loved and lost, but also those people that I might have called my enemies. Because I was starting to realize if God made all of us in his image and likeness, all of them must be able to reflect those qualities of God with nothing else added. So I was thinking that the people that created that painful memory for me as a child, the ones that called themselves Christians, I started to realize that those neighbors of mine that seemed to cause me so much pain, if they were made in God's image and likeness, if God wasn't violent and bullying, it couldn't have appeared in those neighbors of mine by reflection. Then recently I was able to turn it even to things like politics and even the war going on in Ukraine. I realized that both sides of a political divide are made up of men and women. And all of those men and women were originally made in God's image and likeness. So at some point we're like brothers and sisters in Christ. And the same applies even to a war. The opposing sides of wars are made up of different portions of populations, all men and women and children that were all made in God's image and likeness, as given in first Genesis. This gave me great hope for a way that I could start praying differently about all of the material evidence and the news that was coming to me, all the shocking stories about death and destruction going on at what seemed to be human will. This became a great peace and comfort for me, learning how to pray this way. But there was still something I couldn't understand. I couldn't understand what had happened to all those symptoms on the night of that lecture. How could those symptoms that had been measured and recorded for all of those years, how could they just disappear in the twinkling of an eye? It really didn't make any sense to me at all, until I came across a brilliant answer in another week's Bible lesson. And once again, it started with a Bible-based promise. It came from the book of John, where Jesus is quoted as saying, "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Now, the truth that Jesus is referring to here, it's not just a mundane truth like 2 + 2 = 4, as useful as that would be. It's more likely that he's talking about the spiritual truth of our spiritual identity as given in 1st Genesis, made in God's image and likeness. Mrs. Eddy, in her own words, she says this: "Consciousness constructs a better body when faith in matter has been conquered. Correct material belief by spiritual understanding, and spirit will form you anew." Let me just pause there for a moment, if you don't mind. It says consciousness constructs a better body when faith in matter has been conquered. Correct material belief by spiritual understanding. Now, to me, this could be a simple symbol, if you like, of what a strongly held material belief can be. This is a strongly held material opinion by those medical experts, but it's not a spiritual law, is it? It's just a strongly held medical opinion. So Mrs. Eddy is saying correct material belief by spiritual understanding, which I'm going to symbolize by this radio to symbolize my spiritual sense. The spiritual sense, which is a conscious, constant capacity to understand God. So Mrs. Eddy says, correct material belief by spiritual understanding, and spirit will form you anew. You can just pop back into shape, just like the dish sponge. Just like the original image and likeness of God, we are described as in 1st Genesis, without the flaws, without the limitations, without the diseases or the disabilities. That's the nature of God's description of us in 1st Genesis. Mrs. Eddy went further in that week's lesson by asking this question: if sickness is real, it belongs to immortality. If true, it is a part of truth. Would you attempt, with drugs or without, to destroy a quality or condition of truth? Let me just pause there for a moment. This is how it occurred to me when I first read it. If sickness is real, it's a part of truth, she says. Can you change the truth with drugs? Now, for me, if something's true, it's unchanging, like 2 + 2 = 4. So if 2 + 2 = 4 for me today, I can confidently accept that 1,000 years ago, 2 + 2 would still have made 4. And I can confidently predict that in another 1,000 years' time, 2 + 2 will still make 4. That to me is a truth, right? It never changes. It's constant. Mrs. Eddy is saying, if sickness is real, it belongs to truth. Would you attempt, with drugs or without, to destroy a quality or condition of truth? So I now imagined, in my mind's eye, if I poured medicine over 2 + 2, could I stop it making 4? No. What about if I surgically operated on 2 + 2? Could I stop it making 4? No. What about if I give it counselling and said, we don't mind if you want to be a 3 today or a 5 tomorrow? No, that wouldn't work either. 2 + 2 is a fixed fact, isn't it? It's 4. It's never going to change. Mrs. Eddy then asks this question. She says, but if sickness and sin are illusions, the awakening from this mortal dream or illusion will bring us into health, holiness, and immortality. This awakening is the forever coming of Christ, the advanced appearing of truth, which casts out error and heals the sick. This is the salvation which comes through God, the divine principle love, as demonstrated by Jesus. That love, that completely flooded Mrs. Eddy's consciousness in those fateful moments in 1866, that Mrs. Eddy got a new view of God as the presence of love that completely transformed her well-being. A similar love that many people have recounted in the years since, including myself coming to that lecture. That sense of love that flooded me while I was sitting in that venue. It gave me a completely new view of God as being the presence and the power of that divine love that I'd never been conscious of before. It completely transformed my well-being. This was the love that Jesus taught and practiced in his own healing ministry almost 1900 years ago, before Mrs. Eddy discovered it. Those qualities that Jesus was demonstrating, he was able to reflect that love, if you like, into all the situations he was called into, because he understood the source of love to be God. He understood its source was infinite. Therefore, he could reflect it into every situation that he came. Jesus didn't own the love. He didn't bring the love. He simply reflected what was there already and made it conscious to those in and around his healing work. This became an incredible introduction to me to the really practical healings that were promised in the Bible. These were all based on God's promises. They were prophesied. Then they were produced in the life and times of Christ Jesus. Yes, they seem to have been forgotten for about 1900 years, until Mrs. Eddy comes along and she discovers that those same healing laws are still fully present and fully operational, but they're waiting for us to become conscious of them. And how do we become conscious of them? Mrs. Eddy describes that spiritual sense as a conscious, constant capacity to understand God. The God who made all of us in God's image and likeness, every man, woman and child in creation. The God that put those laws into our hearts and our minds, that gives us the ability to hear that divine message from God to men, speaking to our human consciousness through that mind of Christ that we can elect into our own thinking. This became such a rich vein for me to explore to the depths, as much as I can, about the nature and quality of God first, and then how we can apply it practically in our daily lives. And it wasn't just for me. I was starting to attend the weekly church services every Sunday, and they also have what's called a Wednesday testimony meeting. These Wednesday night testimony meetings are incredible because the members of the congregation will simply stand up and they'll testify to all the different types of challenges that you can imagine that they've faced. This way, they've learned to pray in Christian Science. The result was healing. Sometimes people write in testimonies to the Christian Science magazines. There's two types of magazines. There's a monthly Christian Science journal and a weekly Christian Science Sentinel. If you're interested in them, we can get copies sent to you from the contact details at the end of the lecture. But basically, these magazines have been published for well over 100 years, and every edition dedicates at least a few pages to written healing testimonies submitted by people like you and I, who've come across all kinds of healing challenges. Some of us have tried every known alternative and still not found a cure. They've come to Christian Science and learned to pray this way, and the result was healing. This is not just some kind of a closed shop or a special group or society. This is a freely available blessing within every community that the churches appear in, willingly offering these healing lessons every Sunday, the weekly Bible lesson that you can study 6 days leading up to Sunday, and the magazines that you can study to support your understanding during the week. This was a phenomenal introduction to me, as I said, about the practical relevance of the Bible today. But I noticed how much the members of these churches are thinking outward, not just about themselves, but about their communities, about their countries, and even about the world at large. Just by way of sharing, hopefully, another convincing description of just how unconditional these laws of God are, I'd like to tell you a healing account that happened in my own family just a couple of years after I'd started the study and practice of Christian Science. And it happened to my younger brother. I happened to be coming home for what we call a bank holiday weekend. It was the Easter weekend. I was coming into the front door of the house, and as I was entering that door, my brother was coming in the back door of the house, but he was holding in front of him a badly broken arm. He had just fallen off his mountain bike, and he came over to me and he said, look, he said, I'm in agony. He said, take me to the hospital, please. I said, yes, I'll take you to the hospital. But would you like me to pray for you in Christian Science as well? I said. No, he said, I don't want prayer. I want anesthetic right now. He said, I'm in agony. So I said, okay, I'll take you to the hospital. We drove to the hospital. The accident and emergency team, they x-rayed him and they confirmed it was a particularly bad break. But they also said that because it was so close to the elbow joint, he'd have to spend a lot longer in plaster than for your average broken bone. So my brother said, oh, my finals for my degree are coming up in a couple of weeks. I'm going to need that hand. The doctor said, I'm sorry, you won't be using that hand in a couple of weeks. So my brother is saddened by this. The next thing that happened was the doctor delivered a body blow to my brother. He turned to him and he said, Mr. Hockley, it's now almost 9:30 p.m. on Good Friday. The fracture clinic closed at 5 and doesn't reopen until Tuesday morning at 8. So I can't book you in for a hard plaster cast until then. However, between now and then, I'll give you really strong support. He said, I'll really bandage that tightly to the body and I'll give you whopping great painkillers. You won't feel a thing. My brother then realized that he's going to have to sleep on an unprotected broken arm for 4 nights, knowing full well that he was a very restless sleeper and he rolled around a lot in his sleep. So he starts to feel really faint and his colour drains. He looked at me and he said, Philip, is prayer still an option? He may as well have said to me, Philip, are there radio waves in this room? What do you think I said? Yes, I said, prayer is still an option. And on the way home, it's about a 15-minute drive to the family home, I just started describing for him the first early lessons I'd learned in Christian Science about how God made man, that's every man, woman and child, in God's image and likeness, and how God was the source of infinite life and truth and love, that God put those laws into our hearts and our minds, and that we have this spiritual sense, which is above the 5 material senses. We can tune in, if you like, or become conscious of constant capacity to understand God. My brother was gently nodding and he was kind of agreeing. But when we got back to the house, I said, so how does that make you feel? And he said, well, nothing's changed. I don't feel any different. I said, but how does it feel to be God's image and likeness? Well, I know how an image and likeness works, he said. That doesn't change things. He said, I stand here, I face a mirror, my image and likeness reflects back at me. I said, no. I said, we are God's image and likeness. I said, we've got to back up onto the mirror. And I literally made him back up onto the mirror with me. And we're standing now with our back at the mirror, and we're looking at the space in front of us and thinking about what God is. And he'd already learnt that God is the infinite spirit of life and truth and love. And I could see him looking at the space in front of him and then glancing down at his arm, then looking at the space in front of him and glancing down at his arm. And then all of a sudden his countenance started to soften. And then he started smiling and he said, oh, don't be so ridiculous, he said. God couldn't fall off a mountain bike. And he said, don't be so ridiculous. God couldn't have a broken arm like this. I'm off to bed, he said. He took himself off to bed and I didn't see him until the following morning. When he came into the living room, he was beaming. And he said, look, he said, all the swelling's gone down and I'm in no pain. But I do still want to go to the hospital on Tuesday to get this checked. I said, no problem. I'll take you to the hospital on Tuesday. And then I just bandaged up those loose bandages. I just tightened them up for him. Tuesday morning came around and I drove him to the hospital appointment. The doctors at the accident and emergency that x-rayed him on Friday, they'd now passed him over to the fracture clinic. And the fracture clinic doctors said, we'll take a fresh x-ray today in case things have changed over the weekend, so that we put the plaster on the needful part. So they x-rayed him, and the doctor puts the x-ray up on his light box, and he says, Mr. Hockley, he says, who told you you have a broken arm? And my brother said, well, on Friday, he said, accident and emergency did. So they now ring accident and emergency and ask them to send up Friday's images. So Friday's image comes now, and he now has 2 images up on the light box. So he pointed to Friday's image and he said, look, he said, on Friday, I can see you had a broken arm. What was the doctor seeing with? This is the symbol of material sense. The doctor was seeing with one of his 5 material senses. Now remember, I was there on Friday, and when my brother came into the house, with my material senses, I saw what looked like a dreadful situation. In fact, it was so shocking to me that I reverted to my spiritual sense in prayer immediately. And I basically said, oh, Father, what do you see? And immediately I heard these comforting words, I haven't fallen today, neither has my image and likeness, which was referring to my brother in that situation. So I held on to those words through the whole hospital visit on Friday. But now on Tuesday, the doctor is saying, I can see on Friday's x-ray you had a broken arm. But he said, look at today's x-ray. He said, I can't see a break. He said, can you do some tests for me? He said, can you stretch out your arm without pain? My brother stretched out his arm with no pain. He said, can you clench your fist back and forth without pain? My brother was able to clench his fist back and forth with no pain. The doctor said, that concludes for me, you don't have a broken arm, you're free to go. Now, you can be sure we left that hospital rejoicing, yes. But more importantly, this became a pivotal moment in my brother's life. Because just like me, up until that point of meeting Christian Science, he'd been a complete atheist. He'd never studied the Bible. And yet he described something to me about that night which convinced me that he'd had a Bible-based experience of a new view of God for himself. And he said this. He said, when the doctor told me in the hospital I couldn't have a hard plaster cast that night, he said, I panicked, knowing that I rolled around in my sleep. And then he said, you offered to pray with me. And he said, you talked about what God is and how we're God's image and likeness. And it didn't make much sense, he said, until we got home and you made me stand with my back against that mirror. He said, when I was thinking about being God's image and likeness and what God was in front of the mirror, he said, I couldn't imagine God falling off the bike, and I couldn't imagine God having a broken arm. He said, I felt this strange sense of being comforted. And he said, I went to bed and I slept like a baby. When he said he felt comforted, I knew he'd had a Bible-based experience of a new view of God. Because Jesus said as he was leaving his earthly ministry, he said as much. He said, I'm about to leave you now, but I will pray the Father that he will send you another comforter. And this comforter will stay with you through all time. My brother, who had never studied the Bible before in his life, in a moment of absolute need, he experienced for himself a new view of God in the presence and the power of that comforter, one of God's qualities. My brother's well-being was transformed in that instant. My brother, on a scale of 1 to 10 of Bible students, you could say he was down at the 0. And yet, way up at the far end of Bible students, maybe 9 or 10 out of 10, you would have found somebody like Mrs. Eddy, who studied the Bible every day of her life. And yet, Mrs. Eddy had a new view of God in 1866, which completely transformed her well-being. So this shows for me that it doesn't matter where you fall on the scale of Bible knowledge or lack of. It doesn't matter to the laws of God, which are unconditional. Just like these radio waves, for instance, these radio waves are unconditional, aren't they? They don't care whether I'm young or old or male or female or rich or poor. Look, the radio waves, they're just passing through every fibre of my body. Right? Unconditionally, yes? The laws of God in similar fashion, they are unconditionally ever present, but they're waiting for us to become conscious of them. And how do we become conscious of them? This is how prayer is taught in Christian Science. Prayer in Christian Science, remember, is quietening those material senses and tuning in, if you like, with your spiritual sense. That spiritual sense which is a conscious, constant capacity to understand God, all of God's nature, all of God's qualities and God's laws. Those laws of God which are written in our hearts and our minds. Why? Because we're made in God's image and likeness. First Genesis. And how do we hear those words in our own thinking? Mrs. Eddy describes it as the Christ being the true idea voicing good, the divine message from God to men, speaking to our human consciousness. And yes, we can let that mind be in us, which was also in Christ Jesus. Because this used to be the mystery, now it's been revealed to us. It is Christ in us, our hope of glory. This became such a convincing experience in my brother's life that it turned him from many of his choices up until that point, which were very much self-directed and self-absorbed. He started to become much more generous, much more outward thinking, and much more present for family and friends and neighbours than he had ever been before. It was a big change in his life. And what we're hoping and praying, the church members that have sponsored the church, all the technical guys and gals working behind the scenes to make this appear, and myself, we've been working on this lecture for a couple of months. We're all hoping and praying that something similar can happen for you, that you'll try this for yourselves. You won't just take my word for it. Try it for yourself by quietening those 5 material senses, or just ignoring them if they won't be quiet, and tune in with your spiritual sense. See if you can hear the divine message from God to men speaking to your human consciousness. Mrs. Eddy made this discovery and was transformed in her own life. But she didn't keep it to herself. She started to heal others, she started to teach others, and she started to write about it. And this became the basis of the formation of all the churches around the world, the Christian Science churches and Christian Science societies that we have today. And the contact details that are just about to follow will show you where there may be one close to your area if you're interested. This is a huge blessing, that I feel that I can now face all of the trials that my life has placed in my path ever since being introduced to Christian Science and this type of prayer. This has given me the confidence to pray about how I can face all of the trials of family life, society, and the world at large. And Mrs. Eddy even wrote a few words over 100 years ago which speak even to the problems we're facing today, including the warfare that's going on in Eastern Europe. It comes from page 340 of Science and Health, and she said this: "One infinite God, good, unifies men and nations, constitutes the brotherhood of man, ends wars, fulfills the scripture, love thy neighbour as thyself, annihilates pagan and Christian idolatry, whatever is wrong in social, civil, criminal, political and religious codes, equalizes the sexes, annuls the curse on man, and leaves nothing that can sin, suffer, be punished or destroyed." Very powerful words, very heartfelt words about what happens when we learn for ourselves to identify ourselves the way that Jesus described, that when we know the truth about our spiritual identity, that truth can set us free. That when we understand ourselves as all being made in God's image and likeness, not only can this bring health and harmony in our own lives, but it can harmonize our relationships with family and friends and even enemies. This is such a needful thing in the world at the present time, it seems. And we hope and pray that by presenting these lectures, you'll find some tools for yourself, that you can try praying this way for yourself. And if you've been told you're a hopeless case, like I was, you may be able to find hope. If you've been told you're incurable, like I was, you may be able to seek a cure by the same healing prayers. Thank you so much for giving us the time today and we sincerely hope that this helps in some way. Thank you and goodbye.